This is Adopting Identities, written by This Is Entertaining, read to you by Evening Ruby. Chapter 5. The thing they don't tell you about sharing a house with veterans, super spies, kidnapped victims, human experiments, and Robomen is that they all wake up early, if they sleep at all. Fortunately, Spider-Man kinda sorta maybe fit half those categories. However, Spider-Man had never been in a bed nearly as comfy as the no-doubt $1,000,000 mattress he spent the night in, and so he spent nearly an hour in a content and lazy daze. Only the smell of coffee impossibly wafting into his room could drag him out of his warm and luscious cocoon. As Peter stood back from the bed, he looked at the fluffy comforter sitting in a haphazard lump and considered bundling in its cozy confines as he made his way to find the coffee. The thought was tempting, but ultimately Peter decided that he wasn't that comfortable with the Avengers yet. With a mournful sigh, the boy bid farewell to the nighttime friend and moved to the door with a final waking yawn. He stepped into the hallway, only to jump back with a yelp. Shiny metal floors may add to Tony's whole fancy high-tech minimalist look, but they did not conduct heat well at all, and he didn't have any slippers. Peter sighed as his still sleep-lazy mind debated between going back to put on socks or not. He fell against the wall with a grunt, and the walls weren't nearly as cold as the floor. And since he no longer had his arachnid-based secret... With a grin, the boy jumped to the nearest wall, sticking comfortably against the smooth material. Skittering through the hall and along the ceiling without fear of getting caught by either May or a foster parent was completely a novel experience, but not an unwelcome one, and the boy even opted to wall walk along the stairs corridor rather than take the elevator. Following the scent of coffee, he soon found the team sitting around the couches in the main room. Each had a mug in hand and a plate nearby filled with breakfast delights. The bar in the corner of the room was filled with a breakfast buffet that made the boy's mouth water from the ceiling. He was just about to drop and begin loading his plate when the word Spider-Man floated across the room. The boy's head tilted in curiosity, and he moved closer to the group to listen in. Even as a slight pang of guilt stabbed at him for eavesdropping, he ignored it. There was no way he was missing on a chance to hear what the world's greatest superhero team thought about his crime-fighting persona. Tony was folded over a small tablet device, scowling at it with an intensely serious concentration. The others, however, seemed to be deep in a debate over, well, him. Not sure. I mean, yeah, he's gone after some big guys like that lizard thing, but for the most part he seems to stick to muggings, petty theft, stuff like that, Rhodey said, waving a piece of bacon for emphasis. Of course he does. Natasha smirked. Have you ever looked at the video files Tony found? The guy doesn't even know how to throw a proper punch, much less fight. He'd be dead by now if it weren't for his strength and what I have to guess is a fairly significant healing factor. Peter grimaced. Harsh, but accurate. Which means he's probably not a super soldier, Sam adds with a nod at Steve. If he was, then it would be safe to assume some sort of training. Human experimentation isn't likely either, Pepper cut in. He seems the type to shut something like that down, most likely in a very obvious and exaggerated way to draw the public's eye. You assume he was unwilling. Wanda interrupts, her hands on her cup tightening, as she no doubt remembers the willingness of her and her brother to undergo experimentation for the sake of their country. Pepper inclined her head in a nod of acquiescence, but began to point out that if he were a willing candidate, whoever experimented on him would certainly either try to keep him out of the public eye more, or train him to fight better. Up on the ceiling, A tingling dread completely separate from his spidey sense began to pool in Peter's chest. Something wasn't right. How could they ever assume he was part of a super soldier program? Him? Wimpy Peter Parker? Even the National Guard recruiter who'd visited his high school hadn't even looked at him twice. And human experimentation? They could just ask. He would tell them. He'd even be willing to give Tony a blood sample if he could look at it with him. In fact, he might ask Tony if they can use all of Dr. Banner's fancy tech and look at his DNA. But that's besides the point. They didn't need to gossip about him here. They could just ask him about all of this stuff. So why weren't they? The tingling dread settled heavier in his gut until it felt like the weight would force the boy off his perch. Something about this conversation, about the words they were using, the phrases, something was off. It wasn't until Natasha spoke next that the uneasy weight turned into a piercing stab of horror. Whoever he is, I'd bet cleanup duty that Spider-Man is a dancer or a gymnast in his everyday life. Peter nearly fell off the ceiling. He's flexible, the woman continued, unknowing of the utter turmoil she had inflicted on their new charge. Extremely so. Unless all of that comes from his source of powers, it's impossible to keep up that level of flexibility. It'd be easier if he's younger, Rhodey cut in. Rumor is he's pretty young. Steve nodded. I'd be shocked to hear any number above 25, probably lower. Natasha snorted. 20, 21 tops. Try listening to some of the audio Tony stored of his chatter. And Peter had to get out of there. The boy nearly sprint-crawled out of the room, dropping silently to the floor in front of the nearest bathroom and locking himself in for a private freak-out. Okay, this was not good. The boy drew in a shaky breath, his whole body trembling in fear as a heavy weight settled in his gut, and his heart attempted to pound out of his chest. His mind seemed to be whirling with the thoughts and emotions as confusion, denial, anxiety, and fear swarmed through his body, leaving his hands numb and his legs weak. Peter allowed himself to fall back against the locked door and slide down to the cool tiled floor. What did this even mean? How did they not know he was Spider-Man? But what? How was that possible? They had more resources than anyone since S.H.I.E.L.D. had collapsed. Black Widow had actually stalked him the other night. They adopted him. They had to know, but it didn't sound like a prank. Even if some of them would come up with something like this, there was no way that all of them would agree to go along with it. No, this was all too real. It was terrifying. He had voluntarily chosen to live with superheroes who didn't know his secret identity, and he thought it was hard hiding from his foster families. These guys had a constantly vigilant artificial intelligence. They were literally a group of trained spies, certified geniuses, and a mind reader. This whole secret identity had gotten a whole lot more complicated. Of course, things couldn't actually be getting easier. He had the Parker luck, after all. The knowledge that they had no clue who he really was changed everything. It changed how he was going to train, to interact with the Avengers. It would even have to change how he acted like Spidey. He was going to need to put up a lot of safeguards in place just to be able to fight crime normally. Forget fighting alongside the Avengers. No one could know he was anything more than just Peter Parker. Just Peter Parker. Why did the Avengers adopt just Peter Parker? Tony mentioned his IQ a couple of times, bragged to the others about their scientist bond. Tony's words. But that couldn't be it. At least not the whole story. But then, why? The boy's thoughts were quieted when an aborted click of someone trying to open the locked door sounded, followed by a few knocks. Occupied? The teen yelled, standing silently and moving to flush the toilet, washing his hands afterwards to continue the ruse. It's fine, Rhodey's voice chuckled from the hall. I forgot there was one more of us. Take your time. Peter opened the door at the man's last words, smile grimacing in a way that he hoped played off as normal embarrassment and awkwardness rather than abject horror and confusion, as it truly was. No, I was done anyway. Is breakfast almost ready? He stammered, attempting to hide the fact that he'd already been in the room, albeit from a somewhat unconventional angle. The man nodded as he maneuvered around the teen. Ready and waiting. You know where to go. The area with all the couches, right? Peter stammered. Yup. See you there in a second. Right. Peter nodded to the closing door. He wondered silently to himself how many cups of coffee the veteran had drunken to be in such a rush, but soon shut down that line of thought and turned to the living room. The vigilante took a deep breath before making his way to the living room to face the heroes. Funny, he felt much more like a fly than a spider. With a final steadying breath, the boy crossed the line to the living room, preparing to start dancing to avoid a nearly invisible trap line that lay in every moment and every word of a conversation. He was greeted with smiles and calls of "Good morning," with an enthusiasm and formality reserved for when greeting guests or those you are still getting used to. It was as though nothing had changed from the night before. Of course, for them, nothing had. The boy smiled and gave a nervous "Good morning" in return, his stomach trying to tie itself into knots. Still, even in the deepest recesses of his panicked state, Peter was still a teenage boy, and with an advanced metabolism at that. He was distracted almost immediately by the heavenly scents of bacon, eggs, pancakes, and verifiable bakery selection pastries. Whoa, he breathed. The pile looked even bigger from the floor. Light chuckles sounded from the set of couches as Steve called, "Take whatever you like. There's plenty." The teen didn't have to be told twice, grabbing a plate and piling it high with anything and everything from a decadent pancake to fruit salad littered with fruits he swore he'd never heard of. He even managed to swipe a cup of coffee, freshly roasted with a name he couldn't even try to pronounce. The group very obviously shifted as he awkwardly made his way to the couches, clearing up a seat with the best access to the table. This, looks delicious," the boy stammered, attempting to fill the silence. "Do you guys eat like this all the time?" "Pretty much." Dwanda smiled, a Danish in hand. Peter nearly moaned as he bit into the pancakes, savoring the incredible flavor. They tasted like how commercial pancakes looked, light and fluffy, but full of flavor and drenched in actual, real maple syrup. "This is amazing," he managed in between stuffing another bite in. "Who made them?" "Chef Marcel works mornings, I believe," Pepper answered before taking a sip out of an oversized mug of coffee. Peter's eyebrows shot up at the thought of a professional chef cooking just for them, but his mouth was too full of decadent pastry to answer. Luckily, Sam seemed to catch on to the motion. "Yeah, threw me for a loop at first, too. We tried to cook ourselves for a bit, but cooking for 5 to 10 people, including a super soldier and a guy that turns into the Hulk, a Norse god, Natasha, it becomes a bit much. I burn more calories in a single workout than you have in your entire life." Black Widow scoffs at the Falcon, but the man just grinned. "They cook in the cafeteria for the other employees of the tower," Pepper interrupted. "One of the perks of being employed by Stark Enterprises." "Wow," the boy responded as he turned to the perfectly cooked eggs. You would have tried their cooking last night, but we came back so late that they had already gone home, the woman continued. I wanted to call them up anyway, if you remember. Tony cut in as he moved his hands in a few definite motions on the pad. But I got outvoted. You like breakfast? Just wait for dinner. Chef Lorenzo is fantastic. And done. Sorry if the elevator didn't work, kid. I thought people your age like to sleep in. Had a few tests to run on Friday, so all systems were down. It was fine. I just used the stairs. I thought it would wake me up. Tony nodded, still looking at the tablet, but Peter felt a flood of relief. If all systems were down, that meant the AI wouldn't have seen his wall crawl. His secret was safe for a little while longer. So, we were talking about Spider-Man, right? Steve responded, looking sideways at Peter, as though unsure if they should continue talking about the vigilante in front of him. The boy suddenly realized that he should have no clue who they had been talking about, and quickly forced on a surprised expression, albeit a beat too late. Whoa! Spider-Man? Cool. Is he, an Avenger too? Do you want him to be? The boy would have preferred to ask, but he didn't dare. Nope, Tony replied. Can't even figure out who he is, honestly. Tried following him around once, but he always disappears into one of the parts of Queens too sketchy to have security cameras up. He changes where he disappears every few weeks, too. Can't figure out a real pattern for it, and it's messing with my algorithm. Peter realized dully that getting kicked out of foster homes on a regular basis was actually saving his identity. We wouldn't want to invite him now anyway, Pepper interrupted, briskly before Tony could go into details. Why not? Peter stammered. The woman grimaced. PR nightmare. Amazingly, Spider-Man somehow managed to get a worse reputation than us. It would be murder right now. Several others rolled their eyes as though the two were missing out on the most important reasons, but Vision spoke before anyone else could. I believe you have contributed somewhat yourself to his marred image, correct? Huh? What do you mean? The boy asked frantically, attempting to remember the times he had embarrassed Spider-Man. Oh, outside the mask? Your photography for one of his most critical newspapers. Oh, right! That. The Avengers all watched the boy carefully, curious as to why the boy who was so eager to move in with the group of superheroes would be so antagonistic to a spider-themed vigilante. I mean, I guess I don't really have anything against Spider-Man, or anything. Quite the opposite, actually. Usually, he had his moments. I think he's trying really hard to be a hero, even though no one's really appreciating it. Honestly, Jameson was just the only one crazy enough to take a picture, taken by a 15-year-old with no questions asked. He shrugged, more than ready to drop the subject and stop talking about himself in the third person. I don't blame him. We looked through some of your work. It's really impressive. Peter's cheeks heated in bright blush at the praise, but Natasha spoke up before he could reply. Yes, very impressive. Some of them were incredibly detailed. You managed to get very close to him for some of these, didn't you? She leaned forward as she spoke, her eyes boring into him intensely. I guess I'm just sneaky? She smirked and leaned back, eyes softening with the uptick of her lips. Very sneaky. It's impressive. I can't wait to see what you'll be like with training. Really? I took a trip out the other day to see if you actually had skill or if Spider-Man was just that unobservant. He made me before I got in 100 yards. We'll have to compare tactics. She winked at him. Oh, well that explains so much. I don't really know if I'm that good or anything. I think he mostly just doesn't see me as a threat and ignores me. There. Maybe that would throw them off his scent. After all, He wasn't quite sure how to be sneaky when it didn't include being on a ceiling. Really? Sam asked, one brow raising sardonically. You give the man calling for Spider-Man's head on a pike 90% of the photos he's used to call the guy a menace, and you don't think you bother him? That was a really good point. Okay, Baby Peter wasn't the best liar, but honestly, Aunt May was a little bit less hyper-observant and paranoid. I didn't think of anything like that. Were you never afraid that he'd be angry about your photographs? Wanda asked, head tilting curiously. No, not really. Oh no. He did not mean to say that out loud. There had to be a better answer he could have come up with. What he really needed was a distraction, but apparently they all loved discussing vigilantes over breakfast. I mean, he's not really the scary type. Wait, he wasn't the only vigilante around. Not like Daredevil, he nearly shouted as inspiration struck. I was able to get a photo of him once, and it was terrifying. The instant I took the picture, he looked at me. I swore he heard the shutter, and we were like 20 yards apart. And there were like bullets flying everywhere, and people fighting and everything. I got them to keep my name off that picture, but I was convinced he'd find me for like a week. Natasha was smiling and nodding proudly, as though the story confirmed her earlier mentioned desire to hone his stealth skills. Most of the others, however, looked horrified. Why were you somewhere where bullets were flying everywhere and people fighting in the middle of the night in the first place? Sam asked, his tone accusatory. Just the right place at the right time? As their expressions turned even more panicked, the boy quickly corrected. I mean, wrong. Wrong place at the wrong time, of course. Lies, all of it. Honestly, he'd gone to the warehouse in the first place because he'd heard the same rumors Daredevil had apparently followed. But then, he'd gotten there and saw the hero who managed to get the #1 spot on JJ's payout list. Spider-Man used to be the top, but Peter brought in so many photos the demand was low. Already had the situation well in hand, and honestly, web fluid was expensive. He'd been jumpy for a couple of weeks, but other than a long-haired and somewhat portly man hanging around the school for a few days, nothing had happened. And that was probably someone's relative or something. Peter was almost certain he was just being paranoid. He would have been completely paranoid if the man hadn't started staring at him so much. Then, of course, he'd met Daredevil in the suit, and while he was pretty sure the other vigilante had no clue that he was a photographer, the thought of being found out still, honestly, scared him. This photo, Pepper suddenly asked, bringing up a picture in the article on a large screen facing the couches. The image was an ominous piece, far more solemn than anything he'd managed to Spider-Man. Taken just as Daredevil decked a man across the face, the gun that had been in the goon's hand was flying through the air, and the wall behind the vigilante was riddled with small bullet holes. Between the photo and the story was a small caption that read, "Photo credited to Anonymous." After that was a legendary article accusing Daredevil of being part of the Russian mob, despite the fact that he was fighting the Russian mob in the photo. Yeah, that's it. I got a lot more money for that one, he said wistfully. He'd never gotten another photo of the terrifying man, but honestly, even that money wasn't worth the stress. Well, you don't need to worry about money anymore, so no more superhero paparazzi for you, Tony said with a loud slurp of his coffee. Huh? He hadn't even considered money, or quitting work at the paper, but it made sense. He didn't need to work anymore if he was living with the billionaires. Pepper grimaced, but she nodded as well. I'm sorry, Peter, but it really would be best if you quit. It wouldn't look good if you continued to work for a newspaper famous for bashing superheroes after the Avengers took you in. It would seem as if you'd been coerced in some way and were unhappy here. Oh, I guess that makes sense. His heart ached a little. Not because he enjoyed the job, but more because it was yet another part of his old life that was fading away. "If they would even let you work there after this gets out," Rhodey added. "The Daily Bugle isn't exactly our biggest fans at the moment." "Oh yeah, I'm really sorry about that. Some of the articles blaming you so much they're all just terrible." He looked Scarlet Witch in the eyes as he spoke, and she smiled softly at him in response, even as her hands clenched tighter around the mug. It was Steve who responded, however. "We've all grieved silently for the people who were hurt on our watch." Tony abruptly moved to pour Bailey's into his coffee, but said nothing. "And because of it, the public didn't see any of it. Now they think we don't care about the losses, and they're angry. It's understandable, but now we're gonna work to fix that." Peter nodded. He's heard all about the recovery programs the Avengers are starting to put in place. The Bugle was doing everything they could to find a way to make it sound bad, with little success so far. "And since we're on the subject," the living icon continued, "we would like to apologize and offer condolences for the many losses you've had." Thanks? But why?" This time, Pepper sighed, glancing sideways at Tony, who was now drinking Bailey's with a splash of coffee. "I'm not sure if it's ever occurred to you, but nearly every loss you've had has been related to at least one person on the team, be it directly, indirectly, or even through negligence." Her guilty eyes softened somewhat, and she placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's horrible that you've had to go through so much, and so much of it was our fault in some way, so we would like to apologize for your loss." Peter shook his head, heart aching as the image of loved ones flashed through his mind's eye. "I don't—" The boy shook his head as the woman's words processed further, and he realized, "That's stupid. You guys were saving the whole world. You were fighting evil geniuses and aliens and robots, and you saved millions of lives. It sucks, and it hurts, and I know that it'll probably never stop hurting, but I understand that it's not possible to save every single person when you're saving everyone. I never even considered blaming you guys for it." No, he was saving the blame for himself. The Avengers had protected the whole world. He hadn't even been able to manage the handful of people that mattered the most. No wonder they didn't want him for their team. "Well, not everyone felt that way," Steve said bitterly, looking out the window and remembering the events of a few weeks back. Tony nodded solemnly as he gently ran his hands down his girlfriend's arm, tracing the area that had still been in a sling only a few days prior. "That's one of the reasons why we're so happy you agreed to live with us." The man said something else, but the words seemed to fade as several points swirled at the forefront of Peter's mind, painting a picture that the boy wished stayed a muddled canvas. The Avengers, bad press, recovery projects, trying to take responsibility for the casualties, his family's deaths, all horribly linked to the heroes, his adoption now, right when they needed the press. "Is that why I'm here?" He breathed softly, feeling his eyes sting as he looked at the brown in his coffee. "Is that why you adopted me?" he asked louder. "Am I just part of your little publicity stunt to show that you feel bad about all the people who die? Am I just a pity story for you to flash? Is that why I'm here?" He felt his grip tighten as the group remained silent, the metal mug beginning to dent with the force of his anger and misery. He couldn't believe he hadn't figured it out earlier. Couldn't believe he would fall for something like this. Wasn't he supposed to be smart? Apparently not, since he... "That is part of it." A smooth and calm voice shattered the silence. Angry hisses of "fission" sounded after the man's words. Peter looked up to catch the red man's calm eyes. "The boy knows. There's no point in lying or attempting to hide it. Yes, Peter. That's a part of it. Our desire to show a physical example of our responsibility to those who grieve the ones we could not save was our motivation to adopt. However, it's not why you're here. You're here because you are an extraordinary young man. You show a level of intelligence, character, and maturity that few achieve in their entire lives. You have faced great loss, but allowed it to grow you rather than crush you. Perhaps our image was the reason behind looking to adopt, but you, Peter, you in particular are here because, on paper, you seemed an extraordinary young man, and in person, it proved to be even more so. I hope this answer is sufficient to fight any concerns you may have about your place here. Peter gasped. Oh, yeah.